Welcome to Maddie Stone.
Let's see if I can figure out how to turn a microphone on. There it goes. So hi, thank y'all all for showing up early morning on a Saturday, a little chilly, and thank you to Paul and the rest of the BSides Charleston crew for having me here. I'm really excited, and it's my first time in Charleston and walking around yesterday. It's gorgeous and so much good food, so thanks for having me. But this morning I want to talk about switching sides and sharing the practical benefits that I've seen in switching from red to blue to purple. Oops. So first, who am I? My name is Maddie Stone. My pronouns are she and her. And as Paul said, I am a security researcher on Google's Project Zero team and have been in the InfoSec community for about 7 years now, which has predominantly been all reverse engineering, but on a lot of different sides, which is sort of what I want to talk about today. Also like to speak at things and do some other stuff. My Twitter handle is Maddie Stone. Really great at OPSEC, you know, and everything like that. But that tends to be the easiest way to get in touch with me, and I'd love to continue talking and chatting with y'all after even today in this conference. But getting into this, what is my goal for this talk? What am I hoping to take advantage of this chance that y'all are giving me, you know, an hour of your time, which, you know, wow, thank you, is I want to encourage all of us to consider switching between both the offensive and the defensive security roles. Being willing to try the other side, even if we feel really proud and really tied to the current side we've been working on, and also talk about how together, not just as individuals, I do believe it benefits all of us to become more purple instead of just starkly red versus blue. But first, I'm going to share this and my points of view from my experiences. I can't really speak to each and every one else's, so I want to share why I believe it's important to switch from red to blue, why I think it can benefit you from my experiences doing it, and really getting into sort of the tactical, practical benefits that sort of surprised me in that I saw. So yeah, disclaimer, my opinions. So just to level set, what do we mean by red and blue and purple? What are these different sides? If you go ahead and try to start Googling, looking for an exact definition of what does it mean to be red security, what does it mean to be blue, you're gonna find a lot of different opinions. So before we get into the rest of this, I just want to talk to you about where I'm coming from and what I mean when I say those two, so we can sort of level set. So first, red. So to me, the red side of InfoSec is where you're adopting the adversary's TTPs, meaning techniques, tactics, and procedures, as well as their point of view in how to test an organization. So you're still doing this to make things more secure, but you're doing it from the offensive point of view. And you're really trying to emulate and push that device, that enterprise, that organization, in showing this is what the bad folks or the bad actors could do to us, so how do we get better in securing against that? And here are some of the roles or actions that to me fall clearly into red. And it's obviously not comprehensive, but first we have penetration testing, which is sort of the most broad. You are trying to break something that could be in the whole into an organization. It could be trying to break one specific piece of software, could be trying to get into and steal information from a device, but you are trying to penetrate the security boundaries as an attacker would. The next one, instead of focusing more on a lot of the technical controls or maybe physical controls, you're focusing on the human element of security. So that's social engineering. And so those might be included in pen tests in terms of, you know, phishing exercises where you're trying to craft phishing emails to see how many people in our organization is still going to respond or fall for it, as well as trying to solicit information from the different organization. The next one, getting more into less of the human enterprise section, more into just the technical aspects, is vulnerability research. And so that is where software device, you are looking for specific vulnerabilities that then often through coordinated disclosure or other things you are trying to get patched and fixed. So that is the more targeted, let's find that vulnerability and get it fixed. Adversary simulation being a sort of type of penetration test in a lot of ways, but in an adversary simulation, you are specifically trying to use the exact sort of modeling your behavior and actions after a specific adversary. So sometimes that is for the state-sponsored actors of they want to do a really intensive penetration test knowing this state-sponsored actor usually has access to this type of scientific equipment, they usually have this much skills, this much money, and so we are going to do that much more sophisticated. Or it could be our threat is script kiddies. So we want to do an adversary simulation of how far can someone get by just using what you could generally find on GitHub or things like that. And then another form of red is exploit development. So you are maybe doing vulnerability research, maybe you are trying to craft a patch, so not just using a 0 day, but an end day, meaning it should have been patched a few weeks, a few months, a few years ago. You go ahead and weaponize it into an exploit to then test against what your network or your device or your corporation. And so these for me are all examples of what red. So it's a lot bigger than just when we talk about a red team in an exercise or a red cell within a security team. It's much more broad in all of these actions that is doing security or trying to do offense for the sake of defense. And on the other side of the coin, we have blue. So the blue teams are trying to protect an organization's infrastructures and devices from the attack, and so they're also the ones building and maintaining all of the defenses, aka doing the defense for the sake of defense rather than offense. And just like red, they're a lot more than just the blue team on an exercise or the blue cell. They're doing a whole lot of defensive actions, often using the same technical techniques as the red side, but for a different purpose. So security ops centers, SOCs, and everything that goes along with that of monitoring, trying to understand when there might have been an intrusion, responding, deciding if it's false positive, things like that is obviously in the blue side. Malware analysis, so on red you may be using reverse engineering skills for vulnerability research, exploit development, where you can use those exact same skills for blue in terms of malware analysis and making that decision. 1, is the sample good or bad? 2, how does it work? Why might it be successful? How much priority do we need to assess and learn, and what type of defenses do we need to build? Threat intelligence is getting to behind that malware analysis, meaning who are the actors, how is this being used, and the larger context. Incident response is another category of blue, meaning we need to respond immediately, figure out what's going, who do we need to pull in. And finally, digital forensics, looking backwards to decide what did happen versus what is happening now, what can we learn from it, how do we need to change our actions. And so this is a very broad but quick overview of some of the types of roles and actions that fall into red and blue for me. And while this might have been a basics or a refresher for some of you, I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page as we talk forward. And if, oh, okay, I need to update Chrome. Got it. And what was I saying? So if you did not see your role listed here, you know whether you're likely doing security work or you are helping security through offensive, defensive, and it doesn't mean it's any less. But so let's just get a feel of who else is in this room for us. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you identify more as red, if you identify more as blue, or the third option is none of the above, all of the above, somewhere in the between. So first, if you identify more on the side of red security, raise your hand. Okay, we got a sprinkle in here. What about blue? Sweet, we got a lot of blue teamers and a lot of pride associated with that too. And none of the above, all of the above, something. Cool, that's great. So I'm glad to see so many of y'all in the middle too. And I want to encourage you to continue chatting with each other, finding someone who might work in a different area than you do as we go through today, because sometimes these events and conferences, the talks are great, and I'm glad I'm not talking to an empty room, but the networking is really one of those aspects, and learning about other people's experiences and jobs is what we can really get out of these types of things. So, based on that, why did I think this talk might be interesting, important, worthy spending an hour on? And it's largely because in the many years that I've been in InfoSec, including my, looking at myself too, is that I've noticed there's a lot of identity associated with whether you fall on the red or the blue side of the spectrum. And there's a lot of pride with that, and having pride in our jobs is great, but not when it's to the detriment of seeing this really strong red versus blue paradigm that we're not able to break out of. And so when I was thinking about this, I first, in figuring out how did I want this talk to go, I decided to post a tweet asking just what is it that draws you to either the red or the blue side of InfoSec? What are the things that you're interested in, and just seeing what the responses may be. And it was maybe it was confirmation bias, but it was pretty interesting. And so the tweet is also linked down at the bottom when I'll share, but the first one, I'm gonna go through some of the sample responses. So one is, red is nice because you get more tangible wins, but sometimes feels like just playing a game. I find blue feels more real and grown up. Of course, both sides matters though. There's a serious rush in gaining access to a system designed to keep you out. Is there a thrill in blue? I prefer red because I can't cope with being blue and waiting for something to happen instead of actively working on preventing it before somebody else has the idea of doing something stupid. Red sounds insanely boring. We all know everything is vulnerable, and given enough time, you will always find a way in, potentially by doing the same thing over and over again. Blue solves problems, and hopefully classes the problems instead of just pointing at them. Red team is just in me. I'm also bad at building things and quite good in the breaking department. Oops, sorry. Straightforward. Blue is where I have the highest leverage value for the business. I can work to eliminate entire classes of bugs as blue, where red tends to be constrained to finding one. Red also usually lacks the authority and positioning to drive fixes, handing off yet another report full of findings that will be accepted without, What are they accepted without? Oh no! Oh, sorry, I tried to get all cool with the graphics and bring forward. Oh. Computers, man. There it is. Accepted without context isn't useful. The statue of David could only have been created by a handful of artists. Any 3-year-old with a hammer can destroy it. I like creating over destroying. So, obviously, what I thought might be a somewhat benign question evokes a lot of feelings and a lot of opinions over one side is right, one side is wrong, the other side's boring, I'm always this other side. And so, to me, I thought this was worth chatting about because it did go along with a lot of my experiences in InfoSec and even sometimes my personal views of red versus blue too. And so I think that maybe we don't need to have such strong ties to the red or the blue side. And I don't know that it serves us to have this much pride, this much fundamental dislike for wanting to work on the other side of the coin. And because what these tweets sort of showed me is that there was this fundamental simplification of the other side. An example is that tweet that said, blue just has to sit and wait for things that happen. Because a lot of the blue teams I've seen, they're actually quite proactive, and of course they have to be reactive when something happens. I mean, that's their job, but they're not just sitting around waiting. And what I've seen in terms of red is often a very nuanced approach to breaking and choosing what to break and how to present those findings to hopefully evoke change. And so it's not just they like to break things, they just like to sit around and wait. There's so much more nuance to that. And we don't necessarily have to have this forced dichotomy of my side's better, my side's more fun, my side has more impact. Because when it comes down to it, we're all in this for the same goal. We want to create a more secure internet, more secure enterprises. So all of our society that is using this crazy amount of technology that is sort of awesome, but also being forced upon us, does not mean that we are in harm's way. And so I think by merging the red and the blue a little bit more and understanding each other and walking in each other's shoes, we can only push forward this goal of securing everyone more easily. And thankfully, there seem to be some people on the thread who also had this point of view. And they shared that they either worked on both sides, they had a lot of respect and liked both sides, and things like that. So for example, this person said they like both sides. Blue because they get to protect people, there's a mission associated, they don't like to kick bad people's butts. Red side, there's this curiosity, anarchist tendencies, and a thrill of poning. Another one said, yes, they're more drawn to blue because the results are more durable, but they acknowledge there's not really any quick wins. But they also know that none of their work would happen without the great minds on red, who demonstrate to them how something's broken and so that they can fix it. And there were a couple people who on their own came up and mentioned they see themselves as more purple as well. I prefer to dabble in both sides of the force. And then some people also get the opportunity to split between about 80% blue work, 20% red, and it sounds like based on the raise of hands, some of y'all in this room are lucky enough to do that as well. And then this one really seemed to evoke to me what I felt as well of red is exciting because you're looking at a system trying to understand how it works. It's like a Rubik's Cube for the first time. It's fascinating, it's exciting, it's frustrating because you never really know if you're close to being done or not. And blue is interesting because you get to come up with ways to address security gaps while balancing business and usability needs. But it's challenging because it requires dealing with pushbacks and escalations. But finally, they acknowledge both sides have pros and cons, and it's just unfortunate that some folks claim one is better than the other. So I'm going to take y'all through now. Hopefully I have convinced you that I think our community could use a little more purple in their lives rather than just red and blue. And I want to show you why I started out being very clearly on one side of the bar, but then I've seen very practical benefits that I didn't expect from switching back and forth that kind of surprised me and have made me a believer in the color purple too. So story time. I was really lucky when I was in undergraduate degree in CS that I did get an offer right out of school. And it was to become a penetration tester at a government research lab right up the coast at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And so my first day on the job, they gave me a box and said, we want you to see how you can break this. Looking back, I probably should have had a little more structure, but it all turned out for the best, and I started going through a lot of blog posts of people I'm lucky enough to call friends, and somehow found my way to a root shell. Funny story, I didn't actually realize that was the goal of doing a penetration test, and so I went to the more senior engineer who was like my point of contact at the time, and I go, okay, so I've done this thing, I have a Linux shell, what do I do next? And he goes, you have a Linux shell? And I was like, yeah, you know, this was a radio device. And he was like, what user are you? And I was like, he was like, type the who am I command, because I didn't even know that much. And so I was like, who am I? And it was like root. And he goes, you're done. And I was like, oh, did I do something wrong? He was like, no, like, you owned the box. And I was like, oh, and he's like, now you got to write it up and explain how you did it, what you did, and what people can do better. And that was really hard, but because I had found a way to break the box, but now I had to see what comes of this, how do we make it better. So I did about 6 months as a pen tester, and then they gave me, asked me if I was interested in taking part in an adversary simulation where they really needed me to be a reverse engineer. And I had never done reverse engineering before, didn't really know what it was, but they were like, on your resume, you have all this computer architecture experience. The TA had told everyone my favorite language was assembly, and so they were like, we're putting some pieces together here. And so in that case, we were trying to emulate a state-sponsored adversary, spend 6 months on this device to see if this fell off the back of the truck, what could we learn from it? And so we spent all this time, you know, basically reverse engineering every line of firmware, just seeing what can we find? What can we learn about this device? How could we attack it? What information would be lost? And things like that. And then I also, for the following 4 years after that, I was basically all reverse engineering all the time, because I really do just love assembly. But I also got some offensive security research in there, doing vulnerability research as well as exploit dev. And so at this time in my life, I was very solidly red. I was that person that was like, red is fun, blue is boring, you sit and wait. And after 4.5 years of doing this work, Google called, and they offered me a job to be a reverse engineer on the Google Play Protect team, which is doing the hunting malware on all Android devices. And I wasn't really sure, but also it was Google. And I figured I'd been doing the same thing for 4.5 years. I was comfortable. I knew I could figure things out in this little niche space I was working in, so why not try something else? So I packed everything up, moved to the West Coast, and for 2 years was working as a malware analyst for Android security, predominantly in the off-market and the pre-installed spaces. So that's where the device and code auditor comes in, because I was going through all of the Android OEM's devices prior to them shipping with my team, trying to see, is there a security vulnerability here? Is there malware? Is there some sort of issue that we need to prevent before it launches to users? And in the off-market space, that means everything that's not on Google Play. So in the US, North America, and Western Europe, Google Play is how most people on Android devices do get their apps. But for the rest of the world, where there's billions and billions of users of Android devices, they predominantly do third-party app stores, peer-to-peer, sideloading, where you download it off of a computer and then often use a USB to load it onto your phone. And so this was a huge space of applications that we were also trying to vet and find anything that could harm users in. And so suddenly my reverse engineering skills had to change drastically, because I went from reverse engineering one piece of firmware for 6 months to needing to get through 100 apps in a day when I was on a queue. And so at first, and to be quite honest, I had thought I would find moving to a malware analysis position kind of boring. I was coming from this background of doing hardware and firmware exploitation, which I thought was cool because you see all these things in the physical world, to moving up to Java apps. And in my, sort of one-track mind brain, I just didn't get how I would find the challenge and fun. But then I started tackling large-scale investigations, working to protect users, and there was this day earlier in February where I was leading an investigation in what we named the Chamois botnet, which I've talked about elsewhere before, which at one point infected 20 million users around the world and was growing really, really quickly. We saw droppers trying to get to hundreds of millions of devices. And so I guess, February 28th, 2019, I put in a solution that was going to protect and block on all 20 million devices where it currently was, but also prevent it from being able to affect other users. And suddenly that high that you get from pwning a box didn't even compare to that feeling of knowing within 72 hours, 2.5 billion devices were going to check in and get that protection. So my mind started to change a little bit. Then in July of this year, after about 2 years, I switched teams within Google to Google Project Zero. If you don't know what the Project Zero team is, we're about 15 security researchers who our goal is to make 0-day hard. A 0-day is a vulnerability that defenders don't know about. So really only attackers have found this vulnerability and are trying to exploit it. And these 0-day exploits that use 0-day vulnerabilities are especially difficult to prevent and detect and fight against because the defenders don't know about them. You don't know you need a patch. You don't know this hole exists. And so our team, sort of MO for the last 5 years, has been to hire security researchers to try and find 0-day vulnerabilities in the same client devices that the bad actors are. So iPhones, Android, Windows, things like that. And the goal is to have bug collisions, which means we're finding the same bugs as the bad actors are, but we reach out to the vendor behind the device to get it patched within 90 days and delivered to users. But when I joined Project Zero, I was joining to start a new role for them. Whereas the conventional Project Zero work has been pretty red in general, you know, it's that pretty pure vulnerability research. I was going to be doing a hybrid of vulnerability research and threat intel. And so now I'm in this new, more purple position. Because some of the goals of this hybrid is that I am studying 0-day exploits use in the wild in order to glean how can we better find other 0 days, make it harder for them to use new 0 days in the wild, and things like that. So an example of that is when a 0-day exploit is used in the wild, do the root cause analysis. Not just the basic, okay, we think it's this bug-ish, it's a use after 3, probably in this driver, and it's going to get patched. Really go down into how exactly did this bug work, and how can we what can we learn from how they likely found it and things like that. And so that's a very blue action because it's sort of like malware analysis where you're looking back at what attackers did. But then using that in terms of red team to inform where should I go and hunt for bugs. So for example, when you are a vulnerability researcher, you often find more than one bug at a time because the developers are usually using a pattern that they have written more than once at a time. But when bad actors find that bug or find those bugs, they only need to use one in their exploit. So our goal is my goal is after I've done that root cause analysis to then use that to inform variant analysis and hopefully burn the rest of the bugs that those attackers have in their cache. And so that's sort of an example of purple, of now using these reverse engineering analysis skills in both the offensive and defensive ways to hopefully make 0-day hard. So I've switched a couple different times. I've told you I didn't really want to switch necessarily all the time, wasn't feeling drawn to it, but I've seen some really exact and somewhat surprising benefits to myself, my career, my team that hopefully might help you as well. So how did Red Experience help me be a better blue teamer? So while I was on the Google Play Protect team, I said we worked on queues, and this was in our pre-installed apps queues. So Android has about 1,100 different OEMs. So OEM meaning like Samsung, Google, Huawei, BB Cool, Cool Mobile, all these different OEMs that predominantly are selling phones in regions other than US. And so that means we have a lot of apps to get through and vet. When the automated systems say, hey, this needs a human review because I can't decide if it's good or bad. And oh yeah, there's also a 24-hour time limit on this for us to give back our feedback. And so this app came into my queue. It looks like your run-of-the-mill diagnostics application, yet I couldn't let it go. To me, I just kept saying, I think something is wrong with this. My gut is telling me there's an issue here. And I couldn't put that to work, and my teammates as well as my manager kept saying, Maddie, it's a diagnostics app. We don't have to like them, but it doesn't break any of the exact rules. Because we see at the top this application was connecting to a socket, and it was receiving information, and it was writing it to a log. And so we're usually only supposed to spend about 5 to 10 minutes on an app, yet I didn't feel that I could flag this as a false positive. Something still felt off, even if I could not verbalize consciously what it was about it. So after looking way, way too long and not listening to my manager and my teammates, I found this method that was called procdmstring. And what it was doing is it was taking all of the commands that it received from the remote socket and writing them to a file that is in the app's private directory under the cache. And that seemed weird because I didn't really see other things within this app that was using that information. So why would they just be writing commands to a file and not be doing anything? So at this point, I'd spent most of the day on it, and my manager was like, you still haven't found anything. You need to let this go and move on to the next app. So instead, I stayed up all night because I still couldn't tell them why, but something just felt so wrong. And finally, I think it was like midnight or something, I found the first hint. I found this daemon number 1, which is a binary running on the firmware image of the phone that was reading and monitoring that text file in the app's private cache directory. And this was interesting and raised red flags because files that are in an app's private directory are supposed to be sandbox. It's not usual for them to be read, written, modified by outside components within the device. And so this was the little flag I needed to keep going, drink more coffee, stay up, and keep figuring this out because I'd gotten another hint. And then what I found is that I put together all the pieces of this arbitrary remote code execution backdoor. And so the way the backdoor worked is that we had this pre-installed app that communicated with the remote socket. It would write to that text file any of the commands it received from the remote socket. Daemon number 1 would then read all the commands from the text file in the app directory and write them to a kernel character device. That kernel character device was then monitored by a second binary daemon on the device, which looked for any commands that were between the tags EXSH. If that command was, whatever text was in between those two tags, it would pass directly to system. System is a Linux call, which means execute this directly. And so then you have an arbitrary remote code execution backdoor where a remote entity can cause any commands they want to be run on this device. And to add insult to injury, they had modified the SE Linux policy that was running on the device to give daemon number 2 extra privileges, so it basically was as close to root as you can get on Android. So, looking back, we all sort of wondered, what was it that made me not let this go and not be willing to say, okay, I've looked, I can't find anything, just go. And I think it's easy, at least for me, a lot of the times to say, oh, it was just my intuition. It was just my gut. I was lucky. But what it turns out is, funny situation, the more work I did, the luckier I got. And when we tried to dive into this even more of why did I find this when the rest of our malware analysis team looked at it at the same time I was and saying, no, it's fine, it's just a diagnostic app. And then we finally got down to it thanks to a senior mentor who kept pushing me to say more than it's my gut, is that I'd written backdoors before in terms of adversary simulation exercises. And the way I had actually done it twice was put it in administrative code and in diagnostics code. And I had also broken it up into different chunks, never putting all of the code together in one place. And so even if I consciously was not able to say, oh yeah, this looks like a backdoor that I would have written, your intuition, your gut grows from all of those different experiences, and so it can tell you that something looks off even before you consciously say, this is exactly the red flag and why I think we need to do more work here. And so by doing a diverse type of work, gaining a diverse type of experiences, we teach our gut, we teach our intuition to find more of what helps us recognize the bad in a sea of false positives. And when you're on blue team and have so many samples, so many signals, so many different things that you're trying to filter out and sort, that can come in extremely handy. The other thing I found that really, really helped me in terms of blue team is that by starting in red, where I'm used to reverse engineering things for long periods of time, used to having a lot of failed bugs that turned out to not be exploitable, looking for vulnerabilities or bugs that did not actually exist, it grows a different type of persistence than pure blue team does. Because you're used to the failure after failure after failure of not finding the way in and continuing to stay until you find it, or find a way in, that I think helps inform that blue of, even though I was supposed to stop working after 5 minutes of looking at the app, I just knew it had to be there, and so I kept with it for much longer. So that's just two practical examples of how I've seen red experience help me be a better malware analysis, blue teamer. But then I definitely found some skills through blue side work that have that I wished I would have had in red and have already helped me in this new purple role on the red sides of that. So first, you have to be so efficient to work well on blue. Because as we say, there is so much you're trying to sort through to find those few nuggets of badness to block that you don't have enough people most of the time, and so you have to prioritize. And in particular, my scripting and tooling capabilities got so much better when I was working as a malware analyst versus as a vulnerability researcher. And the reason, because I saw a lot of samples that were packed, for example, meaning they were obfuscated, you couldn't clearly see what the code was doing. And so you have to make that decision of, how do I quickly get this unpacked so that I can decide whether or not this sample is bad. And whereas previous to joining blue, my goal was always to understand how that packing mechanism or obfuscation mechanism work, that I'm reverse engineering to understand, and then I can write my tooling solution. What I found in malware analysis is that I don't actually have to always understand how the packer works, how the obfuscator works. I just need a solution to unpack it. And so what that meant in terms of scripting, which I often did IDA Python scripting, where IDA Pro is the most commonly used disassembler for reverse engineering, is I did translation rather than understanding and writing a new solution. So I would just translate their code, where they're de-obfuscating or unpacking, into a tool that I was going to run on the sample, so that I didn't have to understand what the algorithm was. Were they using this version of encryption? I just needed to get something else to run it on there. And so I've now even seen that in my bug hunting work for Project Zero, of really taking that deliberate choice of, do I need to understand all of this code, or do I just need something to accomplish the goal? And I've also found that I'm a much quicker at setting up environments for tooling, because I'm not setting it up necessarily for a long-term engagement or exercise. I just need something that will solve the problem now. Another example is attack surface selection. So I think this might be one of the most obvious benefits you could see from blue to red. I think everyone in this room would guess that when you switch between blue or red, if you're going from blue to red, it's helpful because you learn how people are trying to attack whatever you're defending, so you get better at defending against those attacks, and the opposite is true too. If you know how defenders are defending, it gets easier to attack. But at a more specific level, when I was working in blue for the Android security team, I got a much larger and broader knowledge about the whole attack surface, because I was no longer just trying to attack this one driver, for example, running on the phone. I was responsible for defending the whole device. So I had to understand then, how does that driver interact with the SE Linux policies? What DAC is it running under, and things like that. And so that helped me then understand at a larger scale where are holes I might not have considered previously, because I was focused on attacking this one piece. But it also helps in terms of understanding priorities. So if you are a red team, or if you are in a penetration test or an exercise and you're a red team, you need to make decisions on what goals are you trying to help accomplish. And so understanding the choices that the blue team has to make, especially in terms of priorities, where are we prioritizing our defenses, that can help you make your choices of what to attack. Because in some cases, you may choose, I want to attack the same thing that blue team is choosing to prioritize in terms of defenses, because then I'm really testing what they believe is most important and they're putting all their resources into. But at the same time, you might choose the exact opposite choice as well, because you may say, I disagree with your choice to put all your resources into this one section to defend against. I don't think you are prioritizing correctly, and I'm going to show you why with practical results that then you can take up to the execs in order to get more resources for. So there were two cases that already on Project Zero I've seen attack surface understanding to help me. Is first, we did a bug bash against a specific Android device, and we were doing this super quick, about 48 hours of work to see what as a team could we find. And I chose to focus all of my analysis work and my bug bashing against the areas that I knew had been so tough to defend against on the other side as a malware analyst, where I was like, these gaps exist, and fundamentally there's not a good way to close them right now. And so that was super helpful in helping me quickly dive into this 48-hour bug bash to start trying to find things on this device I hadn't looked at before. And another example was, I recently released a public bug in Android Binder driver that was a 0-day being used in the wild. And what it was doing is, in the Binder driver, which is a pretty integral component to Binder, it does the inter-process communication, there was a wait queue object for polling was not tied to the lifetime of the file that it was monitoring. And this allowed for a use after free, which then was able to be used for a kernel privilege escalation. And we found it in this one place. The attackers who were using the 0-day in the wild also found it in that place. And I wanted to do variant analysis, because this seemed like a pretty easy to do mistake in terms of a developer, of not tying the wait queue for polling along with the file handler. And so I went through the Linux kernel, and I wanted to find every place that they used poll wait function. Turns out that was 236 different places that they had poll wait. And I needed to figure out, how do I filter and vet these? Because that is a lot of tedious work. Time, whether you're on red, blue, or purple, is usually the most important resource you have. And so what I did was that I focused and tried to do it in the same way that I looked for malware variants. What is the piece that matters? That was the poll wait. And then what type of signals would make this more likely to be occurring as a actual bug versus the benign, not a bug usage of it. And so that came down to looking at who had submitted the change for the original bug in binder. Did that person submit any of these other changes? What type of drivers were these poll weights in? Were they similar to binder where they're pretty privileged, not super sandbox, or were they a very specific use case that maybe one device in the world used? And so this really helped me use those malware analysis skills of, you have so many samples, how do you filter down this sample size, to this red skill set of looking for vulnerabilities. The last two that I have seen drastic improvements from in terms of blue side, of being red, learning from blue, was communication. And this was kind of surprising to me because I thought of myself as a good communicator while I was on red too. But in terms of red, I often just had to stick to the technical. How do I explain to you what I did? And then then the blue team often was the one who had to make choices, defenses, stuff like that based on the information I gave them. On blue, my timelines were often shrunk much quicker than the report writing and communication skills in red. And I also needed to persuade execs who have a lot of other concerns besides just security to make the choices I wanted. So my communication skills, suddenly I had to portray these technical details to a non-technical audience while persuading them that this is important and I want you to take this action. And so I found that I became much more concise, much more quicker in my writing, and really focusing on the important parts for that. And also in interpersonal communication, a lot of the people you're working with in the middle of an incident or an intrusion, they have a lot of other things going on too. So how in those oral communication can you communicate what they need to know and decide what they need to know quickly and effectively? And lastly is teamwork. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, it was obvious, is that red is often a very solo activity. Even when you're working as a team, you're often working on one specific part yourself, and then maybe you're the reverse engineer looking at this driver, they're looking at network, you have someone else looking at social engineering. So yes, you're on a team, but you're often one-to-one on the computer by yourself. Whereas blue, you're often having to coordinate with so many other people. You're trying to coordinate with your direct team members who might be doing the same role to prioritize, slice up, share, delegate that whole sample size you're trying to vet. You're trying to interact with program managers, product managers, execs who need to understand your technical expertise to make choices. You're needing to work with, for example, incident commanders or the software engineers who are building those defenses that you believe should happen. And so my teamwork skills, delegation, things like that have definitely grown from being on blue as well. And what was cool is I also saw this reflected in the Twitter thread that I mentioned earlier of some people really like blue because of the teamwork aspects that they've noticed in comparison to red. And so I think that's just a really cool, hopeful vibe as well. But overarching, what I learned from blue was tactically I learned how to work smarter, not harder. You're never going to be able to find every single hole that exists in blue, every single way to get in there. Whereas red, you're often only having to look for one to get in. And so you have to become that much more efficient, smarter, work with other people to collaborate. And so I think that's the biggest thing I have brought in now into my purple red actions is how to work intelligently. So I've shared some reasons and the benefits for me that I have seen from switching it up. But I think ultimately it comes down to is whatever side of security you want to work on, and I think it's totally fine to have a side you're drawn to more. I mean, I still do. I think it makes us all better. And when each of us as individuals are better at whatever security we do, that makes all of our teams and our whole infrastructure as, you know, technologists working to help secure people, it makes it stronger, more secure, and things like that. But now what? Hopefully I've somewhat convinced you, those of you who felt pretty strongly on one side or the other, that you should switch it up, but how might you do that? So first, from an individual level, it's hard. I wouldn't recommend necessarily any of us quit our jobs and say, I'm looking for a job on the other side. But I think that we can still find opportunities to work on the other side, whatever you may consider that for you. So whether that's partnering up, or if you are partnering up with a team that maybe they have a rotation opportunity or an opportunity for you to jump in on a single project, or if you are, looking for a job, being willing to consider those on, say, the blue side if you've always been red, or on the red if you've always been blue, even if that's not what you think you're especially good at or have the experience in yet. I also think it's important to regularly meet and have lunch with or chat with folks that work on the other side of you. And I think one of the biggest things I get out of these chats is asking them what their challenges are and understanding why what they do is hard. And that helps give us a little more empathy and understanding for the other side as well. But I also love to ask, what are you doing that you think is cool? Because that really can show you these cool things, that it's not just blue, it's not just red. There are these other nuances and challenges that they have to put into their work and the choices that they make. And I think all of our goal can be just to become a little more purple in general in our work and our considerations of how we go about whatever our roles are. But at the individual level, that's fine, but there are some industry blockers that make this hard for each of us to make those switches. I mean, as much as they say that there is this huge amount of open roles in InfoSec, you only have to go on Twitter for a few minutes to realize that people are really struggling, though, to find all these so-called open roles, and that there is a lot of gatekeeping. There are a lot of experience requirements that make it hard to make those changes or try something new. So I think one thing we can push is to do more rotation programs in our industries, whether it's a few months, 6 months, a year, to allow people to try something new where they always have the option to go back. That was one of the things for me about trying the blue role with Google, is that I knew I could always go back to my job. I had this safety net at JHU APL, and that I could have found more work in exploit dev and firmware and embedded devices if I really didn't like what I was doing. So let's build that out for everyone to have that opportunity. We also need to change experience requirements. I understand that I have had very privileged experience in terms of the job hunting market, is that I've had a lot of people take chances on me when I hadn't proven myself an experience. But I don't think that should be just me, because I think if someone has the basic technical skills, so for example, in my case, that was reverse engineering, it's not that hard of a switch to go from doing it for vulnerability research to malware analysis. There was no way for me to get malware analysis experience unless someone gave me that opportunity and took that chance. And I think that should be the case for everyone. If someone has the basic technical expertise, then trust that they're probably competent enough to make the switch between red and blue and apply it in a new way. I think we also need to be assuming training and ramp-up period in each of our jobs. Why would we assume that someone can come in and do your exact work on your tool set with no ramp-up period? So that allows us to be more flexible in our experience in training, and also makes likely a better workforce, because you're giving them the opportunity to experiment, to fail, and to gain broader experiences. I am a specialist, I will acknowledge that. I just do reverse engineering all the time. But I think it's good to push ourselves to be more generalist in even those niche fields, like trying malware analysis, vulnerability research, bug hunting, threat intel across. And again, I just say more purple. And industry changes are hard. I know I can sometimes fall into the trap of being like, but I'm not the CEO. I'm not even a manager anymore. What can I do? But I think we sometimes discount the amount of power that we each have as individual contributors on a team too. You know, if you look around and you're like, I might not have the title, but I know they all respect my technical expertise, what I bring to this team. And by doing that and taking advantage, we can then push our managers, our leaders, or even just do it ourselves to say, hey, I'm going to take on this mentee for this next quarter. They're going to work with me on the project. Depending on where you work, they may say no if you have tight requirements in terms of info sharing. But I think most of the people I know and most of the place they work are like, cool, okay, don't let it disrupt your current workload. But that now allows you to help share information with others and help make these industry changes. And also, if you are even, a lower level middle manager, then you can also set what the requirements are for the people you hire on your team and be willing to take a little more risks, because often people show up, do the work, and will surprise you. And with that, thank you. I appreciate y'all come sitting here for 60 minutes early on a Saturday morning. And thank you again to the BSides Charleston crew for having me. And I think we have 1 minute for questions if there are any. Oh, no questions. I'll be walking around, so come find me. Thank y'all.